Hello everyone, my name is Vince Emanuele and this is Park Media. Today we have a special guest in store for you. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of CODEPINK. She's also the co-founder of Global Exchange. She was a former Senate candidate, an anti-war activist, and an all-around badass in my eyes. So it's a pleasure to have you on here, Medea.
Great to be on with you.
So you have a pretty long history of activism. For people watching this who don't know you, can we talk a little bit about sort of what politicized you? Were you raised in a political family? At what point in your life did you become involved with social movement politics?
I had a pretty stark aha moment, which is I was in high school during the Vietnam War. My sister, who was 2 years older, her boyfriend got drafted, sent out to Vietnam. He was a really nice guy, but every month he started sending her letters back and they started getting weirder and weirder until about 6 months after he was there, he sent her this ear of a Viet Cong on a string to wear as a necklace. And I remember she opened that package, I saw it and went to the bathroom and threw up and thought, anybody that thinks somebody else's body part is a souvenir has gone crazy and something is wrong with this war. And I became an anti-war activist in high school, formed a little group. We learned how to play some guitar, sang anti-war songs, hooked up with other anti-war groups. That was in Long Island. And I haven't stopped in thinking that don't believe what your government says because governments lie to you. That war is evil, that we shouldn't be killing people, and that it's up to us as citizens to do something about it.
What year was this, Medea, when you were graduating high school?
Well, I graduated this was about 1966.
Okay. And then after that, throughout sort of the late 60s, early 70s, were you continuing to be involved with the anti-Vietnam War movement, or were you moving along with other movements as well?
For a while, I joined SDS, Students for Democratic Society. I went to college and said, this doesn't make sense, dropped out after a semester, and started traveling around the world and actually ended up working or spending a lot of time in Africa, many years in Africa, Latin America, always looking for the perfect society. Every time there was a liberation movement, I said, I'm going to go there. I went to Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Zimbabwe, then to Nicaragua. And I ended up living for almost 4 years in Cuba before realizing that my job was to change my own government. And so I came home and have been working on changing my government ever since. And that was when I came back, it was 1983.
And that was, so you spent about a decade then really traveling all over the place. What did you learn working with those movements, meeting the people that you met along the way in Africa and elsewhere?
I saw the most beautiful movements that were cropping up in different places around the world that had this very humane, compassionate idea that we could create a different world. Many times it was each one teach one, whatever you know, if you know how to read and write, if you know how to play an instrument, if you know how to garden, if you know how to grow things, whatever, your job was to teach someone else. A lot of joy, a lot of community. I remember being in Mozambique in the early days of that revolution with Samora Machel, and he would come to the stadium where people would gather to talk, and before they would talk, he would sing, and they would all sing together. And then being in South Africa, liberation movements there, the beautiful song, the 5-part harmony, and people just, enduring horrible things, but doing it in a way that brought them together with so much commitment and so much love for each other. And what I saw wherever I went, whether it was in Africa or Latin America, was that the US was trying to destroy those efforts. I saw a rebel group called Renamo that cropped up in paid for by South Africa and the United States to destroy the revolution in Mozambique. I saw similar kinds of things, of course, with the Contra in Nicaragua. And wherever I went, I realized that it was during the days of the Cold War. So there were, for example, in many of the places I went, there would be Eastern Europeans, there would be Russians who were trying to help those countries. And the United States would see that as a threat and try to destroy it. So it was a very harsh lesson for me to learn as a young woman that my government was on the wrong side of liberation movements, the wrong side of history. And it made me understand that the most important thing I could do was work to change my government. But it was very beautiful to see all of these efforts, but very sad to see most of them crushed.
Was that a conclusion you came to relatively on your own, or was this something that the activists and organizers in those countries were telling you in terms of, the importance of coming back to the empire to change it from within?
Oh, well, I thought you were asking, was it the people there who told me it was my government who were opposing those efforts?
Oh.
And I was going to say, yes, but it was pretty obvious.
Right.
Except when I first learned about my government was when I was still in high school, and I went to spend some time in Guatemala, and I was studying Spanish there. And there I was taught by people from Guatemala about the history of my country that I knew nothing about. I didn't know that we overthrew their government in 1954. I didn't know who the Dulles brothers were, John Foster Dulles. And I actually learned about my government from being outside the country and having other people tell me about it. In terms of learning to come back, I actually learned it in a hard way, which is oftentimes when I went to countries, I would think, oh, this is great, this is paradise, they've started their revolution. And then little by little found difficulties in accepting some of the things that the government was doing. Maybe it was because they were under siege from the outside. Maybe it's because power corrupts. But in any case, I was a pretty brash young woman who would speak out regularly and got myself in trouble. I got deported from several countries, including Cuba. And that was quite devastating to me because I thought I was a great revolutionary. I'd participate in all the marches. I'd go out for the cleanup days. I was working in my local committee for the defense of the revolution. And then to find out that something that I had done was considered counter-revolutionary, which was I wrote an article about the closing of the farmers' markets, which I thought was a very bad thing to do. And when I wrote about it, I was called in to account for writing what was considered something counter-revolutionary. And then things went downhill from there, and I was eventually deported. So I kind of learned the hard way that if I want to change a society, I should really start with my own.
And what is that experience? That's fascinating. I did not know that about your history at all, Medea. And I'm wondering, because of course on the left in the United States, I think sometimes you've probably experienced this as well. Some activists probably overly glorify certain revolutionary projects. Other activists probably overlook revolutionary projects. So you've had this sort of very nuanced take on the revolution in Cuba since then. What is your sort of relationship or thinking about that now? I didn't want to go necessarily down this route, but I didn't know that history, and I'm interested to know what you think today.
I've had a very nuanced relationship to Cuba ever since I did get kicked out of the country. I got deported with a military escort. I had married a Cuban. He had to decide whether he was going to come with me and leave his entire family and maybe never go back again, because during that time, that was in 1979, when you left. No, that was 1983. When you left, it was you were not going to be allowed back in again. And so our whole lives were turned upside down. And for a long time, I felt very resentful and had a hard time coping with my own personal situation. And then I realized, with the help of other people who had had similar experiences, that it's not about me. It's about the revolution, the Cuban people, what they did live under a dictatorship, what they're trying to build, the US government putting up obstacles all along the path. And yes, mistakes that they made, just like any government makes mistakes. And so over the years, there are things that I don't like about the Cuban Revolution. For example, I always thought it was crazy that they nationalized everything, like every little peanut stand on the street corner, every restaurant, all the things that people need to have their own entrepreneurial spirit for small things like that. So I thought that was a huge mistake. Other things that Cuba's gone back and forth, a lot of it having to do with giving people the chance to have their own small businesses, and not putting enough attention into growing food, for a long time, keeping the agricultural land tied up in sugar production. I wrote a book called No Free Lunch, Food and Revolution in Cuba Today, that looked at that whole agricultural system and how the big state farms that they had built up were kind of like the commercial agriculture in the United States, or like the big Soviet state farms, neither of which were a good model. So I had and have criticisms of Cuba. On the other hand, I love so much about the Cuban Revolution. I love that it taught everybody how to read and write and had the most beautiful literacy program, and that continues to put education as a priority available to everyone. And I love the fact that the healthcare system is one that is not only for making sure that everybody has access to healthcare and preventative medicine and family doctors, but also I think it's quite extraordinary that they have this international program that sends doctors around the world. And that is something that I'm working on a lot now, because I'm part of a group that came together to support this idea that the Cuban International Health Brigades should be getting the Nobel Peace Prize during this time of coronavirus, when they are showing what international solidarity looks like. And while our government is fighting with the World Health Organization and blaming China and stealing personal protective equipment that's destined for another country, the Cubans are showing what a poor, small country can do to go around the world to cure people. So I think it's important to uplift the beautiful things that the Cuban government, the Cuban people, the Cuban Revolution are doing. And what's absolutely disgusting is to see that our government is trying to sabotage that program, labeling it a form of slavery, because the Cubans don't get to keep the entire salary that the foreign government pays, that a good portion of that goes back to the Cuban government to pay for the healthcare system and the education system. And so I'm really intent on trying to counter the US government's efforts to get other countries to not accept Cuban doctors, to try to get Cuban doctors to defect, to plant media stories about how bad this program is. It's just mean-spirited, it's ugly, and it shows, I think, again, the stark contrast between what the government of Cuba is doing, what it taught its doctors, which is you should go anywhere in the world that you can to help cure people, versus what our government does, have a healthcare system that's for profit, that can't keep us alive during this pandemic, but is also trying to destroy what another country is doing.
I do want to move on from this topic, but is there a way that people can support that effort, Medea?
Yeah, it's a great effort. You can go on to the CODEPINK.org website and just look at the Cuba program, and there's a petition there that we'd love you to sign. And very soon we will have a separate website for the coalition called Cuba Nobel, like the Nobel Peace Prize.
Excellent. So it's 1983. How old are you at that point, Medea?
I'm 21.
Okay, you're 21 in 1983. You've lived a hell of a lot of experiences.
No, I'm 31.
Or 31, I'm sorry, yeah. So, because I was wondering, I'm like, you graduated high. Okay, so 31 in 1983, you've already lived 5 or 6 lifetimes compared to a lot of us. What are you doing in 1983? You're deported from Cuba. You've lost a partner. What did you do throughout the 80s? How did you come back and sort of assimilate to American culture and society? What did that look like?
Well, I should say that I lost a partner, but in a different way, which is he came back to the U.S. with me and then fell apart, not being able to deal with U.S. society, U.S. culture. And he ended up becoming drug addicted and a terrible situation. In the meantime, I came back to start working with a group called Food First, also known as the Institute for Food and Development Policy. And that was in San Francisco, where I started writing more. I had written articles before, but then started writing books. And the first book was the one that I mentioned, No Free Lunch. I ended up writing a couple of books about Cuba and got very involved through Food First in other areas, looking at different countries in Central America, and then started looking at larger issues about economic, the international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, and ended up with my other husband at the time and another friend starting a group called Global Exchange, in which we focused on many different things. Some of it was around sweatshops and combating the abuse of workers and the environment through U.S. companies, very well-known clothing and shoe companies, getting involved around the protests of the IMF and the World Bank, very much involved around the Seattle shutdown of the World Trade Organization in 1999. And helped to start what is now the Fair Trade label that you see on things like coffee and tea and chocolates and some other products. And we also started two other things. One is a series of stores that were selling fair trade products from around the globe, and also trips around the world to try to give Americans more of a chance to get out of their insular worldviews and look at the United States from the vantage point of other countries. And so we had a very exciting opportunities for people to go to different places around the world. And we tended to focus on places where the US had a bad relationship so that people would come back and get involved in solidarity movements.
And so this takes us through the 90s. Now it's the early 2000s. George Bush is not really elected, but he's put into the White House. 9/11 takes place. When exactly did you co-found CODEPINK?
I was still at Global Exchange, and we were very involved at Global Exchange in the first Gulf War, 1990, 1991. But when 9/11 happened and we started organizing immediately as Global Exchange to start opposing the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, which happened so quickly. And then when we saw the lead up to the war in Iraq, started organizing around that. But I also had attended a meeting of environmental women, women concerned about the environment, where we talked about the pending war with Iraq and what could we do about it. And we were joking around and saying, well, Bush had started this color-coded alert system. Yellow was mellow, orange, right. A little, you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Red, be very afraid. And we were jokingly saying we need another color-coded alert to say there's another way to deal with this. Bring the people who attacked us to justice as individuals, and not use this as a justification for more war. And we wanted to call it Code Hot Pink, except the URL was taken by a porno site. So we had to become just plain Code Pink, which made a number of the women drop out because they said, if it's not hot pink, I don't want to be part of it. But so, yes, we started Code Pink before the US invasion of Iraq. In fact, we got a group of women together. I think there were about almost 20 of us that went to Iraq in February 2002, right before the invasion, to meet with Iraqi women, to see what they were saying, to see how we could be supporting them. And we were all devastated when the US went ahead and invaded, but we did create an Iraq Occupation Watch Center in Iraq that was a group of women that were Shia, Sunni, Kurdish, quite a diverse group that for a number of years were documenting what the US occupation was doing to the lives of their families and of their communities. And of course, we were involved back in the United States with all the major protests that were going on. And we grew tremendously without even trying to. At one point, I think we had about 300 chapters around the country. They just sprung up all over the place. So we were very active those days. We did hunger strikes in front of the White House. We had a 30-day hunger strike that almost killed some of us. We did a 4-month vigil in the middle of dead of winter, very, very cold winter, trying to highlight more that people had to get up, get out, do something. So we were very active and had a lot of great people that were members of Code Pink in those days, but also worked very closely with so many other groups, veterans groups, religious groups, all kinds of wonderful groups that were part of the anti-war movement during those early years.
What do you think are some of the lessons we could take away from those Bush years? I would like to definitely get up to the Obama years. Will bring us up to the present. But, you know, my experience is very limited because I was living in this insular world in the United States Marine Corps, deploying back and forth to Iraq. So we were really, I think, ignorant to a lot of the anti-war activism that was taking place. And I, of course, had no concept of something like GI resistance or the idea that you could take it upon yourself to do any of these things. Didn't have the confidence, probably didn't even have the courage at that stage until I got home from my second deployment. And I wonder what you think are some of the lessons from those Bush years, you know, leading up to the war, of course, starting in 2003, the war in Iraq. Before that, as you mentioned, the war in Afghanistan. What are some of the lessons we can learn from those years of activism, do you think, during the Bush years?
Well, it was tough because we were so good at getting people out on the street, but we didn't do enough to keep the activism going. I think if we had done something more like the Occupy movement of keeping a lot of people together, going into the halls of Congress and not leaving. You know, you can't get into the White House, but you can get into Congress. We as Code Pink would go to those hearings and disrupt the hearings and cause mayhem, and we would do it with Veterans for Peace. But there weren't enough of us to really shut the whole thing down and to keep it going. So I think one of the lessons is it's not worth putting a whole lot of energy into getting hundreds of thousands of people out for one day. It's much more important to get 50,000 people out or even 5,000 people out and keep them out and keep them in the places of government offices to stop business as usual, whether that was happening in Congress or in the state houses in different states. We should have just kept it going constantly.
Now, I was ignorant at the time in terms of my politics. They were developing. I was becoming more and more radicalized. I think I had a sliver of hope in 2006 when the Democrats took the House and the Senate, was hoping that they would perhaps cut off funding for the war. My local congressman, Pete Visklosky from the 1st Congressional District here in Indiana, called me into his office after the Winter Soldier hearings, which he didn't attend. He sent an aide. It called me into his office and had told me, well, he was excited to tell me, he said, Vince, I want you to know I'm going to back Barack Obama instead of Hillary Clinton. Now, I was hoping he was going to say, hey, Vince, I want you to know I'm going to vote to defund the war along with, at the time, I forget who it was that was proposing the legislation. You might remember, but it was a shock for me. It was a good teachable moment. I learned a lot in that moment with Congressman Visklosky. And then, of course, the Democrats doing virtually nothing after they took the House and the Senate in 2006. And then this, I think, made a lot of us quite jaded, especially those of us who were younger. We saw not a lot of people, but a significant portion of the people we were doing anti-war work with sort of shift their efforts into getting Democrats elected, and then particularly when Barack Obama hit the scene during the primary in 2007. What did you make of that period? You were obviously a lot older than I was. You were a lot more experienced at that time. How were you processing that whole Barack Obama phenomena?
Well, I must say that I drank the Kool-Aid, I think. You're always hoping that there's going to be some savior that's going to come in and bring a little sanity to the situation. And when Obama said that he was against the Iraq War and that gave him the edge over Hillary Clinton, I thought that was great. When he said in some of the debates how I would talk to anybody, I believe in diplomacy. He seemed like the real diplomatic type. When he said the war in Afghanistan was a good war, I said, well, maybe he's just saying that because he wants to get some of the middle of the road types and it's just for his election, but he knows, he's a smart guy. He knows we got to get out of these wars. So I was very excited. And I should say, the war issue is not my only issue. I care about other issues and I care a lot about race issues. And to have the first Black president, to me, was a thrilling thing. I have many friends who this was the highlight of their lives. And I remember going to the inauguration and we got in and we're good at kind of sneaking up. So we snuck up real close to him and we were just so excited about it. I also remember that a couple of really just maybe a month into his first month of presidency, he was giving a talk at a university in Washington, D.C. And I guess they didn't have their security very tight then because I managed to get in and actually talk to him. And I talked to him about Afghanistan. And, he has a good line. And he said, oh, yes, we want to get out of there. We're going to do whatever we can to get out of there. So I was very optimistic. But, we kept our guard up and we kept trying to work as CODEPINK to be pushing to cut the funding, to really end those wars. And then we saw Obama getting in, not only keeping the wars going, but starting drone warfare and not closing Guantanamo. And to then later on to see him actually taking us into new wars like the war in Libya, that was devastating. I think two good things that he did. One was to have the Iran nuclear deal signed, which there was a real breakthrough and could have led to a de-escalation of a lot of the conflicts in the Middle East. And the other was diplomatic relations with Cuba. So long overdue and so beautiful to see that happening. So there were a couple of highlights on the foreign policy front, but as you know well, Vince, for the most part, it was the war business as usual.
And you wrote a book, I believe, about you did write a book on drone warfare, if I'm correct. And I apologize, I haven't read it, but we should do a separate interview just about that book. And I know your most recent book is about U.S.-Saudi relations. I know that's out from OR Books because that's on its way here. So,
and one I did after that is on Iran.
Oh, you did another one as well. How many books have you written, Medea?
I've written, I think, about 10.
Wow. See, I had no idea, and I'm ignorant for that. I knew that you wrote the book on drones. I knew you wrote the book on U.S.-Saudi relations. I was just emailing with Peter Kuznick, who I'm interviewing tomorrow, and he said, hey, please tell Medea I said hello. And I told him, I was giving him a little idea of different project, the other project that we were working on, just kind of talking with him a little bit about collaboration and so forth. And he was like, I didn't know Medea wrote. And I said, yeah, I started doing some research. Turns out she's quite a prolific writer. She has quite a few books. So I apologize for that.
Not at all. And Peter obviously is a way better writer. The last two books I wrote were really because I wanted to learn myself about these issues. And I felt that it was important to write in a simple way, so they're more like primers for people to get the basics. And I think they've been very useful to people who know very little about Saudi Arabia, the US-Saudi history, all of that. And then, Iran, there's just so much to talk about in that culture, and it's so misunderstood in the United States. But anyway, I kind of saw them both as part of the activism work, because you really, as an activist, you have to know what you're talking about, and what better way to learn than to write about it.
And write about it in a way that ordinary people can understand. It's been one of my...
And we traveled to those regions. I've been to Iran several times. When I did the book on drones, we went to Yemen, been to Afghanistan a number of times. And so, if you have the opportunity to actually be on the ground and see for yourself, as you well know, you had an opportunity in a different way, but it becomes so much more real to you.
Absolutely. So leading through the Obama years, what did that activism look like, say, towards as you said, you sort of had some optimism, to your point about race relations and how important that was. As a matter of fact, the only reason I voted for Barack Obama in 2008 was because the person that I met who got me involved with Iraq Veterans Against the War is a gentleman by the name of Nick Egnance. And he was the first person I had met at Valparaiso University during a forum. I had just come home from the Marine Corps, and my dad told me about this event at Valparaiso University. I went to it. It was a debate about the war in Iraq. Half of the panel was arguing for the war. The other half was arguing against it. Afterward, they had asked people to sort of raise their hands and give comments. I raised my hand, identified myself as a veteran who agreed with the side of the panel who was against the war. And this squirrely-looking gentleman came running towards me with a Veterans for Peace baseball hat on that had about 100 different buttons attached to it. And he said, Vince, I have an organization you have to join. It's called Iraq Veterans Against the War, and I'm taking you there this weekend to meet Aaron Hughes. And I said, okay, great. And I was ready to get involved at that point. And Nick, I think a lot of us in IVAW were, quite jaded for many reasons by the time we got home. And by 2007, 2008, I didn't want to hear anything about electoral politics. I didn't even want to have a conversation about strategic voting. I was 23, 24 years old. I wanted the revolution. I wanted it now, and I didn't want to hear anything else. Okay, so Nick Egnance gets a hold of me, and he says, hey, Vince, for those of us who fought for civil rights, for those of us who lived through that era, just the symbolism alone for us means the world. And I heard this, of course, from also my African-American friends and different allies we were working with. I think by the time 2012 came along, there were a lot of people, and not myself, but I think others who were optimistic about Obama, who I think by 2012 really kind of came to the realization of this is who this is what we're going to get, and now what does that look like? Because at the same time, we have the occupation in Wisconsin, the big union occupation that we attended, and then also we have Occupy Wall Street. Where did you find yourself during that period, sort of the second term of Obama, transitioning probably out of having any optimism about what he was going to do, outside of course, Iran and Cuba, and I agree with that.
Yeah, I was bummed out after the first 2 years of Obama's first term to see that they had the possibility to do so many things and just blew it time after time after time and kept funding the damn war in Iraq. And so we, and as CODEPINK and myself personally, didn't give up fighting against the government during that time. And I mentioned the book I did on drones, but we did a lot of protesting against the drone warfare, going to the bases where the drones are being used, protesting at the headquarters of the drone manufacturers, doing vigils and a lot of educational work. And when there was the threat of the invasion of Libya, we got very involved in that. The Syria, when Obama drew his line in the sand, that was a time that we started immediately. We called it a peace insurrection outside of the White House and Congress, and went every single day into the halls of Congress saying, no way can we support U.S. military involvement in Syria. And that was very interesting, Vince, because at that time, the Tea Party was very strong.
Yep.
And they would oppose anything Obama was in favor of. Of course, if it was a Republican who wanted to invade another country, they'd probably be cheering for it. But in this case, they were very much against it. And so we teamed up with them, literally, physically, like meeting at the same spot outside of Congress and walking through the halls and into the offices together to oppose that, which was successful. I mean, in the end, Obama knew he didn't have the votes for it in Congress and didn't go ahead. So we did a lot of organizing during that time, but we lost our base in around the country. People had already dropped out of the peace movement. They had already gone on to other things. We had the financial crisis, which really affected people personally. We had the environmental movement, which also affects all of us. And the wars just seemed like they were dragging on. So as you know, it was hard during those years to get people involved. And it became quite lonely in the last years because there were so many other compelling issues that took people away from the peace movement. And yet we had not, except for the Iran issue, really accomplished very much.
And this is something I would like to ask you about in terms of rebuilding the anti-war movement, or how you would even, if you would even put it that way. What do you think needs to be done now? I mean, we could go into the last 4 years, but to be quite honest with you, I don't see any need for us to sort of say what everybody else has been saying. Though I do think what I do find the only thing I find interesting, genuinely interesting about Trump's campaign in 2015 and 16 was that he spoke in anti-war rhetoric during the primaries. And I paid attention to that because the polls also show that the majority of Republicans want us out of Afghanistan, want us out of Iraq, they want us out of Syria. To your point about the Tea Party, I remember those protests in 2013 quite vividly. We had people in downtown Chicago who were adamantly opposed to Barack Obama for any number of reasons, but they were also opposed to the war in Syria. I agree with you that that might be different if there was a Republican in charge, but no less. This was the same in the UK. When I was speaking with my friends, it was the first time I believe the British Parliament had voted against a military action or war in its history.
That's right. If it weren't for them, we probably wouldn't have been successful in our efforts. So yes, that was historic.
And so I wonder, instead of kind of hashing out how horrific Trump has been, because I know he has escalated the drone strikes, we could go on and on. On the other end, I guess maybe the other thing I would find interesting about Trump is this willingness to talk to people, although I think many people have legitimate concerns that the people he's most willing to talk to are the most authoritarian governments around the world. But then he doesn't want to talk to other people.
Before we dismiss the years so far of Trump,
yeah,
I want to go back to, I think, something that you were mentioning about how for some people in the anti-war movement, it was anti-Bush, anti-Republican, and that as soon as Obama came in, then they didn't want to do anything against the government. And I find that same partisanship now, that people will oppose anything that Trump is doing.
Right.
And I think we have to love peace more than we dislike Donald Trump.
Yep.
And when he was making the first overtures to North Korea, we thought that was fantastic. And not only applauded him, but joined in with this wonderful movement called Women Cross the DMZ, and went to North Korea, crossed over into South Korea. And that was 5 years ago. We've been part of watching and participating in this wonderful movement that has been encouraging Trump to keep talking to North Korea. And unfortunately, we have to fight the Democrats on that front. And then you see how much there was this obsession about Russia from the Democratic Party, and how dangerous that is and how overblown it was. I mean, give me a break, the way the US CIA intervenes in governments all over the world. I mean, right now we have US ships that are trying to stop Iran from trading with Venezuela. That's right. And trying to overthrow the government there, both governments, Iran and Venezuela. And, you know, we are so upset about Russian interference and turn it into an anti-Russia campaign, obsession. And that's really dangerous. And now, of course, we have Trump doing it around China. But I think we can't allow ourselves to be pushed and pulled by partisan politics. We really have to be very sincere about this. When Trump wanted to pull troops out of Syria, we said, well, he should do it in a way that would not lead to a massacre of the Kurds, but yes, pull out of Syria.
Right.
And then he's been negotiating, and Zalmay Khalilzad, negotiating very seriously in Afghanistan to get a peace plan. I know that there were Democrats who were kind of poo-pooing that whole thing and going back to the whole damn thing about what's going to happen to the women, which was, Laura Bush and one of the justifications in the first place.
It's so cynical.
You know it, Vince, but I think for all of your viewers or listeners, we have to be very clear that it's not about party politics for us. It's about stopping the killing.
And how do you think that's best expressed to a people? And I like to sort of break apart American society. On the one hand, we have, I'm sure you get this from your friends overseas. Something will happen in the United States and people say, what the hell is wrong with people in your country? And I'll say, well, it's actually about 10% of people in our country who agree with this or agree with that or whatever it may be, even like the protesters today. It's still a very small percentage of Americans. So I wonder, do you think that's a matter of us talking about our values and principles more than talking about maybe these specific issues? What would be the way in your thinking that we could sort of transcend some of this hyper-partisanship to then talk more about these are our principles regardless of who's in power? I would have these conversations with my friends in the Bernie Sanders campaign. Of course, we volunteered with the campaign. We did so because we saw it as an opportunity to reach out to ordinary people who wouldn't otherwise be involved with political activism, particularly in a small Rust Belt town like where we live, or in the region like we live in Northwest Indiana, where there is not like a number of organizations like in the Bay Area or New York or Chicago that you could kind of plug into and work with. But we saw one of the big flaws with the Bernie Sanders campaign, and there were a few, I guess you could argue there were many, but one of the fundamental flaws that we saw, of course, was probably not enough emphasis on the connection between U.S. militarism abroad, U.S. empire, and the kind of austerity measures that Bernie was opposing. So at this point, I feel like that's over with now. We have Trump in office. I don't know if Joe Biden's going to end up the nominee. I mean, it looks more and more absurd every day. How are you processing what's happening now just politically and then, operating within that context? But then also, how does this relate to trying to rebuild this anti-war movement in this new sort of uncertain context that we're in?
Well, we can't talk about the context we're in without talking about this pandemic as well.
Right.
So it's a time in history that we could never have really imagined what it would be like to try to be organizing, especially people who are being are sheltering at home, how we're starting to move into safe forms of protesting, like the caravanning kind of thing, not knowing how much into the future we will still feel it's not socially responsible to be getting out in large numbers in the streets. So this is all very difficult to figure out. And on the other hand, it has been a time of a lot of reflection for millions of people about why is it that the United States was so totally unable to take care of its own people during this time, and why there are so many other countries around the world that have done such a better job than we have. So for issues like Medicare for all, I think there's a lot more to work with in terms of openness of the American people towards a system that actually takes care of everyone. And then you would think that there would be more openness in terms of looking at how we're spending our money and what makes us safe. I mean, talk about national security. I haven't seen recent polls, but I am certain that people would put pandemics and the climate among the very top things that they are worried about, and not Iran, let's say.
Yep.
So, and it's also interesting to look at the military in light of this pandemic, to say that the military is not able to keep us safe. So it should be a time when there is much more openness about redefining national security and redefining what we spend our money on. And I know that the Pentagon had wanted more money in the last legislation that passed, and did not get any more money, which is a positive thing. And that there is a letter that about almost 36 Congress people signed saying the Pentagon should not get any increases in the next in the next military budget. And that is a start. I mean, for us, that's absurd. It should be more like we should cut the damn budget in half.
Yeah. 90%.
Yeah, right. But it's a beginning of a conversation that was very hard to have beforehand. And so I think now our job as organizers is really to get very specific about what we should cut, what would be possible to cut. For example, Elizabeth Warren during her campaign talked about cutting the overseas contingent operations money, which would have amounted to several $100 billion over the course of 10 years. That's a good thing to focus on. There's very good organizing being done about the foreign military bases and how much money could be saved by cutting them. There's all kinds of areas that have been identified by the group called People Over Pentagon and the National Priorities Project that show exactly where we could make cuts in the Pentagon budget and be much more secure as a result of that, and have hundreds of billions of dollars to put into needs that are true needs of the people on the planet. So I think we have to get more serious about that and have a year-long campaign where we're really forcing the members of Congress to say, do you want to get us ready? Do you want to help us get out of this pandemic and ready for the next one? And we're in the middle of a climate crisis, but there are going to be even more natural disasters coming that are going to show us just how bad this is. And so we have to focus very directly on the pieces of the Pentagon budget that must be cut. So I think that's a good thing for us to organize around. We're also part of a Divest from the War Machine group that is doing fantastic work. We just have for the last year been focusing on the largest financial managers in the world, and that's BlackRock, and have a coalition that includes people who don't want investments in fossil fuels, in private prisons, in the detention centers for immigrants, in the gun industry, or in the weapons industry. And we can all come together, which we have been doing, to fight this behemoth company, BlackRock. And it's a very, very exciting campaign, but it also has a lot of focuses on the grassroots, because people can get their city to divest from war, which means actually looking at where the investments are now, and if there are companies that make weapons of war, to take that money and invest it in more positive, in really positive things. So we have that. We have the same path that has been forged by the climate environmental movement to divest from fossil fuels, and we have to do the same thing from the weapons companies. So that means divesting pension funds, getting banks to divest, getting cities to divest, getting places of worship to divest, universities, getting university students on this. We have a great group of students in the university in San Luis Obispo who are doing this at the university level. So there's a lot that can be done to make these connections with the other groups, and yet to still keep our focus on how are we going to get out of the weapons industry, both at the national budget level as well as locally.
A few weeks ago, I read a really interesting article from Phyllis Bennis and Reverend William Barber, and what they were talking about was sort of repurposing a lot of the military's logistical and equipment capacities during not just the pandemic, but then, of course, leading into some of what you mentioned, which is runaway climate change, broader ecological devastation. We have these 1,000 military bases, in other words, around the world. We have tons of logistical equipment. Do you think that there's a strategic way to repurpose those things? Do you think that this is something we should be thinking about as we offer up solutions to demilitarize to the public?
You know, in the 80s, there was a very strong conversion movement that was quite successful in a number of ways. And whether it's the weapons industry or whether it's the bases themselves, there are so many needs we have in coming up with solutions to the climate crisis, that as well as finding new ways of living on this planet. I mean, certainly, this is a time of reflecting about how we have to radically change the way we live. And whether it's fast rail systems that can get us out of our cars and out of the air, or whether it's the kind of radical new ways of living in cities that are safe and environmentally sustainable. There are so many ways we have to repurpose our society. And so, yes, I think that this is a time. Now, I don't want to see the military taking the lead on things like, the green movement. And there's a lot of hypocrisy over the military telling us how much it's doing to become more environmentally sound. But I do think that things like the bases, although we must say that a lot of those bases are Superfund sites, both in the United States and overseas, very contaminated. But there's a lot of know-how, as you well know, in the military. There are a lot of great people who do know how to build things, how to engineer things, how to put their minds at a task and get it done. And we need so many things to build a very new and different kind of society. So yes, in terms of those bases don't belong to us. The overseas military bases need to be handed back to the people of those countries. But we do have a lot of bases, as you well know, here in the United States, some of them on the most prime real estate that should be turned into all kinds of other things that are needed for our planet.
So just ending here today, because I don't want to take too much of your time, but a lot of people are confused right now. Medea, you've been doing this for a long time. I think one of the things I like to ask people is not just how they became politicized, which I always find quite interesting, but also how they've maintained the ability to stay involved. Sergio and I often talk about this. Most of the veterans, most of the anti-war activists that we met when we first got involved in, say, 2005, 2006, some of them are still engaged. A lot of them are not. A lot of people get burnt out. A lot of people go through tremendous stress and heartache and or real material pain, being targeted by the police, spending time in jail, frayed relationships, financial problems, all of the things that come along with being involved in these sort of movements sometimes. And I guess it's a two-part question. One is, how do you maintain your strength? How do you continue to fight? What are the sort of things that allow you to do this in a sustainable way? Number one. I guess we could start with that question, and then I'll ask you the second question.
One is building community and having a good group that you can lean on when things get bad for you as well as in the world. The other is to have joy in your life and find ways to use song, and I love to dance. I dance a lot. Of course, my kids are grown and I have grandkids now, but having family relationships that are positive, having some in the work to find some positive things that you can be doing. I gave the example of the Cuban doctors and the Nobel Peace Prize because I get really excited, when I'm outraged when I look at the news, when I see what my government is doing, sending billions of dollars to weapons and destroying the lives of Yemeni people. And that motivates me to do something. But I'm also really motivated when I can be supporting something positive. So trying to have some of the balance there so that we can look towards people who are doing fantastic things in the world and see how can we support their efforts.
Now, this might be an impossible question. I agree with you 100% there. I think that's really good, sage advice for people, particularly things like dancing, music, maybe cooking, spending more time doing these things that we're in a rush constantly, maybe not doing. This is an impossible answer, or an impossible question, and I know that because I've been asking thinkers and activists and people around the world for the last 2.5 months. But what do you think activism and organizing looks like right now in this context? And let's focus, say, specifically here in the United States, because we'll be talking with people overseas. We'll get their perspective of what activism looks like for them in that moment, in that context. But we have this upcoming presidential election. A lot of people are stuck at home. The people who are not, on the other hand, I think there's some really interesting organizing taking place at workplaces across the country. Groups like the Democratic Socialists of America and the United Electrical Workers have teamed up to start unionizing non-unionized workplaces in the U.S. According to the DSA and the UE, they've received 10 times as many requests to unionize non-unionized workplaces than they even have the capacity to conduct in terms of organizing, which is quite something. Say for those of us who are at home, what do you think this looks like? What do you think are the opportunities? What are some of the challenges we face in the midst of this presidential election, in the midst of this pandemic and economic depression? What are some of the ideas that you've seen that you think are successful, or creative ways to protest, creative ways to stay engaged right now?
I do think it's important to be socially responsible, but there are still things that we can do. We are organizing on Memorial Day around the country caravans for peace and disarmament and support for the UN global ceasefire. And I'm excited. I'm in Miami. We've already been confronted by right-wing Cubans and Venezuelans. We're going to the house of the Senator Marco Rubio, who is so awful in this. But we're doing it in our cars. And I think people can do that all over the country. Find out where your your representative lives. And if they're a bad representative and not representing you, go honk at them. And certainly on social media, we can do a lot of that work. The webinars that have been happening all over the country and all over the world have been quite extraordinary. There are some webinars that have 10,000 people on them. Yep. And these opportunities to learn from people around the world and, quote, meet people that you never had a chance to read books that you've never had a chance to read. It's a time for those of us with the luxury of being sheltering at home to put some time into education and learning from these other individuals and organizations. But don't forget the activism part. And there is activism that we can do. I'm joining up with some of the groups that are focusing on the call for prisoners to be let go and to the detention centers. And so I think it's very, very important to support those movements. But I am an optimist, and I don't think that this is going to go on for all that long. I do think it will go on close to to November, though. And so what does that mean? Well, to me, it means we've got to be ready for a contested election between November and January, and a guy in the White House who is not going to want to leave. So I think we've got to get organized to be doing these kind of occupations, whether it's in our vehicles or in our bodies, or however creative way we can do it, to be stopping business as usual if there is a contested election, if there is a stolen election, and if Trump refuses to leave the White House. And whoever thought that we would have this kind of situation, but we're facing extraordinary times, and we better start organizing for what could be even worse times ahead if Trump loses by a very slim margin and refuses to accept the results of those elections and refuses to leave. In any case, no matter who is in the White House, if indeed it is Joe Biden, we got a lot of work to do. Joe Biden's foreign policy is awful. I was just looking at his policies around Israel-Palestine. Oh. They're terrible. And so on the anti-war front, we certainly can't let up no matter who is in the White House. And I think one area where we are not strong enough is really pushing our people in Congress. We let them get away with way too much. And now that people are spending more time at home, and the Congress people are spending more time in their districts, I mean, they're not even going to Washington for the most part, now is the time to really be on their case. Everybody should know who is your congressperson, who is the staff person who's involved in foreign policy issues. You should have a relationship with that person. It might not be a good relationship, but you should have a relationship with that person. They should know who you are, know what your organization is. If you're not part of an organization, either join one now or start one now. We need to be part of groups. There should be statewide groups, peace groups that are connected to the other groups. And I think this is the time to really do the organizing in your district with your Congress people, because they're going to have to oppose the policies of the White House, no matter who is occupying the White House.
I couldn't agree more. I appreciate your time, Medea, and I'm glad that you're feeling positive. I'm not necessarily feeling positive that it'll end anytime soon, but I needed a little shot of positivity this weekend. So I appreciate your thoughts on that as well. I know we mentioned several organizations, but were there any projects or campaigns that you wanted to sort of plug at the end that you want people to check out right now?
Well, there's the Divest from the War Machine, and it's got its own website you can go to. There's the CODEPINK.org, where we do weekly alerts and a lot of very creative kinds of things. This week we had 2 cases we're focusing on in Saudi Arabia, a young man who was arrested when he was a minor and is still in prison for peaceful protests. He had been facing the death penalty, and a woman who is a women's rights activist who was thrown in jail for advocating for women to have the right to drive. And it was actually when the Crown Prince gave women the right to drive that he then threw her and other women into prison. Those are important cases to work on. We're very concerned about the U.S. threats to Venezuela, the U.S. threats to Iran. We're doing a lot of work on the economic sanctions issues. There's a website called Sanctions Kill that is very good and has been doing wonderful webinars with guests from all over the world to hear firsthand about how this economic sanctions is really a kind of warfare that is killing tens of thousands of people. So those are some of the things that I would recommend.
Medea, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on, Vince. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Medea Benjamin with CODEPINK, and one of the, I think, best anti-war activists, writers, thinkers out there today. Follow her work. Go to the websites that she recommended. Make sure to plug in and share those with your friends. I'm Vince Emanuele, and this is Park Media. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parkmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.